Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today we're going to be jumping into our third film breakdown from the 2024 NFL draft class for your Jacksonville Jaguars. So we've gone through Brian Thomas Jr., we've gone through Mason Smith. Now we're going to be focusing on a guy who comes from Florida, comes from Florida State University, in Jarrian Jones. He was a slot cornerback this last year for the Noles. He was a really good player, took a lot of snaps in man coverage, makes a lot of sense for Jacksonville. I will say this, though, and to be clear, you guys right now are viewing my initial evaluation of him. He was not a player I was super high on before the draft. And I said this in my last video, and I want to make it clear again because I think it needs to be said, and I want to make sure that I'm accountable for this, is that when I did my evaluations of a lot of these players, there were a lot of guys towards the back end of my big board that really just didn't get a fair shot on there. I watched players to start probably for about 20 minutes of film, and I made my evaluations. I didn't really watch enough film initially, I think, to get the right gauge on guys. And then as I kept updating my big board, if you were lower, it was harder for me to spend more time reevaluating. And it almost got guys like Renardo Green to never even be high on my big board. But I did get to him. He ended up actually being an early second round pick for me. So given that, I felt like it was appropriate for me, for a lot of these guys, to go back and reevaluate them. Treat it as if I never put them on my big board, try to be unbiased, and just say, as a prospect, where would they rank on my 2024 NFL Draft big board? And so that's what I did with Jarrian Jones. That's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to discuss what I think of him as a player. And there's not a ton that has necessarily changed, but I do think that there are some elements that I want to bring up that I didn't give him credit for. And the overall ranking is going to be a bit better. You know, when they drafted him, you know, I was live streaming, and my initial reaction, I wasn't super excited, but I understood with the pick that this was probably a player that was going to be worth that selection. Like, he's going to be around the late third, early fourth, and I understood as well that he's someone I hadn't really evaluated a whole lot this process. And hopefully that changes in the future. My plan, as far as 2025 and beyond, is to take at least 3 games down from these players from the previous year during summer scouting. So like this cycle, that would be watching 2023 film, and then get 3 games from 2024. So I think that's going to help a lot, get better evaluations on these players and a better idea of who they are as well, because you can get a bad game for a guy and then they just get wiped off your board. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about my initial thoughts. I'm going to go through PFF information with you guys, some of the statistics on him, talking about maybe his differences in the slot versus out wide, because that's an important conversation. I'll show you some film. I'll talk about some things that I have changed my mind on, and then where I ultimately rank him and what my ultimate grade is for the pick. So jumping into that, we'll start by taking a look at PFF. So important information to know here. In 2022, Jarrian Jones was an outside cornerback. And right here, you're seeing 2023 information. So we'll go back and we'll take a look at this. As far as how he graded out, it was relatively good, right? Not incredible, not the best in the world, but it was good. Your baseline on PFF is going to be around 60. If you don't do anything on a play, if you're kind of not a factor, but you don't do anything wrong, that's the grade you're going to get for that play. So Jarrian Jones grading out at a 70 is pretty good. And a lot of this ends up coming from these coverage snaps where he performed very well. He got a 73. You see in some of these other metrics, wasn't that great, but you're not worrying about pass rush a whole lot. Run defense is important, but mainly this came down to coverage, and that's what weighed in so heavily to him getting that 70 grade. And then as far as the snap counts for him in 2022, you take a look here, you will see, let's actually pull off detailed positions. So he spent almost every snap on defense out wide. He ended up taking what is 23 snaps in the slot. So that's the player he was for his 2022 season with the Noles. And a big change happened in 2023, which is where a lot of the conversation comes, especially because Jacksonville has arguably needed an outside cornerback more. And I'd very easily find myself to be a part of that group because I think you got very clearly two guys who can play in the slot. You could even argue three if you want to throw in both Gregory Jr. and Antonio Johnson along with Darnell Savage. So you ideally wanted to get an outside cornerback. Now, you see in 2023, he took 394 snaps in the slot and actually 29 out wide. So both seasons, the second most snaps he took anywhere were actually kick coverage. So it tells you how much he was dedicated to playing in that one role on defense. So a lot of snaps there. Comparing the performances of these 2 years just based off PFF grading, and we'll talk about this on film, of course, too, because it's important to have a good balance between these things because PFF is very valuable, but you also want to see things on film. You know, there's a guy, for example, like I'm scouting for the 2025 class. He didn't grade on PFF, but he might be my number one offensive tackle because the film is really good to me, and there's a lot of things I see that are exciting, but they aren't going to show up on PFF. So it's important to kind of balance those things because both have a lot of value. But you look in 2023 here, and you end up getting some major improvements in some facets of his game. Now, I won't mention this pass rush grade because honestly, pass rushing is not an important thing for a slot cornerback. If you do it, that's great, right? But it's a very, very minor part of things, and so I'm not really going to note on it for that reason. But as far as coverage, took a major step forward, grade out at an 87. That is arguably an elite grade for PFF. You also look at tackling, same grade there. And that's one of these woes that we're going to talk about today, where I think that's the big thing that would stop me from seeing him as a full-time starter at this point in his career. And that's not even talking about players that may deserve snaps more than him. Because obviously, if we're talking about the slot, that's where we think he's going to play, Darnell Savage is a huge investment by the team. That's a big conversation here. But the other thing you see is his run defense did improve. And I would attribute this to how smart of a player he is. And going over, we'll actually just swap back to the pre-draft graphic. Even though this was harsh, right? And I put him at 140th overall, I still understood watching him that he was a player with good instincts. He was smart. He knew when to come down against the run. You didn't see a lot of blunders on film. There's some, of course, but he was a smart player. And I think he continued to get smarter in 2023. He's also got more experience playing all over. That's going to help you understand the defense more. So I really like those things about Jarrian Jones. But talking about the initial evaluation, just getting into some of these notes I had on him to start, I understood that he's an incredibly quick, fluid athlete. He's a very fast player on the field. You'll actually see him on a couple snaps in the film if we get through the whole thing while I'm talking about him. You'll see that he's able to keep up with guys like Malik Neighbors, for example, who is an incredibly fast receiver. Super twitchy as well, someone who's going to be able to make really good cuts on routes. Jarrian Jones was good at covering him. He had a really good game against those guys. You also find with Jarrian Jones that when he does allow separation, he can get back into the play. So I would almost say that his skill set, as far as his speed and overall athleticism, it's great to potentially borderline elite. And that's what makes him exciting as a prospect. But there are a lot of other things that we have to factor in. Now, talking about the detriments, right? I said that he lacks ideal length. And to explain what I mean here, it's not about height as much. Height is actually fine with him. He's actually 6 foot. You'll see he's technically 5'11" and like 9/10, but we'll call it 6 foot because that's literally the closest that you can get. So the height is there, right? But then you look at his hand size. You look at the arm length. In hands, that's not a huge thing. It just helps you catch the ball easier because, more surface area to catch with. But the main thing is the arm length and the wingspan. He is well below average in both of those categories. So, like looking at other guys that I scouted, I'm not sure actually we had a player that had worse measurements. I'm looking through it right now just to confirm. He had the shortest arms of any player, and then the shortest wingspan I had was just under an inch shorter than what Jarrian Jones had. So those are things that are not great about him. But still, I would say that there's exciting things to his game. Sometimes you would find on film as well, reaction speed would leave something to be desired. That was an initial note that I wrote down. That's where you get that little bit of separation. But he is built to be able to make up for that. And then talking about how he is as a run defender. I said that he was not strong enough to be a good run defender and to stay in place. And, this isn't talking about coverage, so it's a little different. But what this ultimately came down to, and what I tried to elaborate on, and we'll talk about here in a moment again, is that he's not a strong tackler. That is something that we saw in both seasons. When you look at the PFF grading, when you watch the film, it is not a strong suit of his game. And so you can be instinctive, you can be smart against the run, and you see that on film, and that's why his grade went up this last year. That does not matter if you can't complete the tackle. Now you will see that he does disrupt some plays. And that's a good thing. As long as you got cavalry coming in with you, you got a shot, right? And that can be a positive. And you see him step up, especially at the end of games, which that'll be another note. I'll try not to spoil everything beforehand. But those were my initial thoughts on him. And as far as the 140th overall grade, a lot of players around that point, it was really just choose who you want. A lot of players with the same grade, a lot of Ds for me in this class as far as where I put them. And what a D would mean is that would be an early day 3 pick. And if you get a D-, that's going to be maybe a late day 3 pick or 5th or 6th round. So that's where we got on a lot of these guys. We'll go ahead. We'll jump into the film, though. I'm going to talk through my updated notes on him. I've got 2 games that I'll show you guys here. One is against Duke. This game will point out where he's at on the field as well. Shout out to the guy with his watermark on there because we're using the content that he put up from the game on YouTube to evaluate this. And then we got another game will be against, I believe, LSU. So you'll see him up against Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas Jr. a little bit. Guy he's going to be going up against hopefully a little bit more in training camp as well as the offseason continues. So you'll see snaps on them. I tried to cut out plays where he wasn't on the field so you guys can get a little bit more action from him. So getting into my updated notes. I will not say yet where I put him, but I added a lot more positives. One thing I wanted to note was that he is an experienced player in man coverage. And if there's a school that Jacksonville was going to pull cornerbacks from for this cycle, Florida State University made a lot of sense to pull cornerbacks from. Because, you talk about Jones, you talk about Bernardo Green. These were players that arguably might have had more man coverage experience and even press coverage experience than every other player in all of college football. These are really high rates that they were undergoing. And so it should not have been shocking that Jacksonville went and picked one of these players. They were local. They were guys that ran in a similar scheme. Once Ryan Nielsen came here, that's something that should have been on our radar. I didn't personally talk about it, but didn't really surprise me a whole ton. Another thing that I really liked about Jarrian Jones, and just getting this from listening to some of his interviews, the way he talks, and then especially watching him, it'll be in the second game you'll see here, and hopefully, like I said, we'll get through all the film. But he is a competitive player, and he is someone who has that mentality you want in a cornerback, where if he makes a bad play, if he gives up something big, and you'll see that, it does not kill him the rest of the game. When I think of a player, I'm not trying to hate on him because I actually like this player a lot going into the process, but when you think of a player who doesn't have that attribute and how bad that can be for a cornerback, look what happened to Kalen King. Kalen King was, I think, pretty clearly a top 10 pick going into last year. That's where people had him, and people can say, well, I wasn't that high on him. That's fine. The general consensus was that Kalen King was an early first-round pick. He went up against Marvin Harrison Jr., and he didn't have answers. Marvin Harrison Jr. killed him, quite frankly. He was not able to recover against him in that game, and it changed something in the way he played. And Kalen King, from that game on, went from being a guy that was supposed to be an early first-round pick, plummeting all the way down to what I think was the 255th overall pick. So when we're talking about things that are important for a cornerback, and I think this is even something I added to my grades for the 2025 NFL draft that we'll talk about with the future cornerbacks in that class, it's that mentality to continue competing, to be able to get up after a bad play and to continue. And you'll see in this game against LSU that after he made a mistake, when he's on the field, he's making some big plays. He's stopping rushes that could get into the end zone. He's getting involved, and that does not get into his head and change the way he plays. And that's something I really liked going back and watching him and then listening to some of the things that he said. This is a guy who has very high expectations of himself, and he's smart enough to accomplish those things. And it's really just a question of, can he put it together on the field? Does he have the body to go do it? And, well, he's limited in length. I do think that he can make up for that. And I think he can be a starter in the NFL. There's things that have to happen, though. And I don't really change my mind as much on them. It's maybe more so that I would say I have faith that he can reach that level. So, talking about some other positives here. I kept some of my original notes, never really out of a play. He's sticky. If he allows separation, he's going to bring it right back. He has that kind of fluidity, that kind of speed on the field, ran a 4.38. He's a very good player in those regards. He shows good discipline as well in zone coverage. I don't know if I'd call him proficient in zone coverage or very good. He didn't play necessarily a ton of it, but he was not a player who would drift out of the way or make major mistakes. They gave him an assignment. He would stick to it. And that's really all I was able to see on film when trying to watch him in those situations. I also found that Jarrian Jones didn't shy away from being physical. We have obviously talked about tackling woes being a major issue, but he was not afraid to try and at least make a tackle. It's just, how do you fix how you go to tackle every play? Because it's consistently poor form. It's consistently not what you want to see there. And then the final positive that I want to talk about here. He had very few targets thrown his way in this last season. I'll confirm the number right now, but I believe in 2023, the most targets he had in a single game was 5 targets. And that was against Virginia Tech. He gave up 3 receptions in that game. The most receptions he ever gave up was 3. So very good cornerback as far as eliminating players. And as well, NFL passer rating they gave up over 2023 was 25.3. If you didn't know, it's a pretty good number. So these are exciting things for Jarrian Jones, and a lot of them things that I did not realize initially that would have impacted where I would have put him. Nevertheless, like, when we're talking about this, you got to understand, I'm not going to sit here and tell you, oh, I would have taken him there, because I wouldn't have. He was low on my board. But as far as do I think the pick was worth it for the Jaguars, that's mainly what we're discussing. Now, getting into concerns, because I think there's still things to talk about there, and I just want to reiterate what I still feel the same about. He is generally undersized in most metrics. Now, his weight, I think, is good enough. I think he could put on a little bit, but he's 190. That's better than actually quite a few players in this class. So, not a huge concern for me, especially if you're playing inside. You got to be fast. You got to be able to go up against guys like Tank Dell, for example. And so, I'm okay with the way his metrics are for playing in that kind of role. And that helps his ceiling as a slot defender. We talked about tackling issues as well. Does not wrap up well. You've seen that on film, I'm sure, by this point. Watching him, you'll see it more if you continue to watch him. And then, just as a run defender, I don't have a lot of confidence. I know the grade improved, and I know he's a smart player, and I know that he's going to be able to improve there. But right now, I do not see him as a guy that I want on the field against the run. If I think there's a run play, it's not someone I'm putting out there if I was in charge. Now, the way I see it, there are a lot of plays too where you'll find him just kind of standing there. When there's supposed to be 2 or 3 guys bringing down the running back. He could be 5 feet away. He won't get involved unless he feels like he absolutely has to. And I don't really like to see that. I want to see a guy who's aggressive. And I don't think aggressive is really something I would use to describe Jarrian Jones. I just don't think that's a good description of what he brings. And so those are things I want to see improve. And that's what really keeps him from being, to me, a good full-time player. Because if Jarrian Jones can end up improving in these facets and becoming more of a complete player, right? Becoming a good run defender, having the size to do it, maybe adding on a little bit of weight and improving his tackling form, getting smarter, I'm not afraid to put him on the field all the time. And I think the bet you want to make is Jacksonville. Picking him in the 3rd round, you're always trying to find ways to save cap, right? And it sounds kind of crazy to pick your replacements the same year that you sign the guy that you'd be replacing. But I do think that with Darnell Savage, like, he'll be here probably 2 or 3 years. And with Jarrian Jones, it's probably the time frame that you're looking for him to improve, to become a complete player. Then maybe year 3, year 4, you can say, hey, we trust this guy enough to play. If Darnell Savage has not absolutely blown his deal out of the water, or he's not living up to what we expected, now we can pivot, we can make a move, and Jarrian Jones can be our slot guy. We have him cheap a couple years, then we can work out the deal. And then, of course, like, even if that doesn't happen, whether it's Savage playing great, which I do think he will, I have a lot of confidence in that, and I think he's going to be someone who sticks around for a while with Jacksonville. But if that happens, or Jarrian Jones doesn't make the huge step forward, I still think he's a good backup. I think that he provides a good skill set to the team that can help improve them. And you keep in mind that the depth at slot cornerback, while we say there's a few guys you could start there, you got to consider that one of them is Antonio Johnson, who is really a strong safety for this team. And the other one is Gregory Jr., who I believe only has 1 year left on his deal. I don't think there's an ERFA option next year, because at some point I believe he was cut. And when you do that, it limits the rookie contract to basically 3 years. So it's like what happened with James Robinson, for example, and why he's out on the free agent open market after year 3. So I think that's probably what we're seeing out of Jarrian Jones, if I had to guess. But, I'm good with that. Like, I don't think it's a home run pick, but if you're talking about value in a pick, it makes sense. And so, didn't get through this whole thing of film. We got about a minute left here, but we are going to go ahead and start wrapping this up. This is my final projection for him, where I would have put him on my big board. Having reevaluated him, keep in mind, of course, if I was to be completely fair, other players are getting revisited too. He might fall, he might rise from there. But just where I was, if I had watched him again before the draft, for me, he would have been my 99th overall prospect, just sneaking in at the top 100. You can see all my notes that I mentioned there as well. And to just summarize what I think of him as a player, still some of the same thoughts, but I changed it up a little bit. And I'll just read through this quick. Jones is a reliable coverage quarterback when playing inside. He has fantastic speed and the quickness to help him match receivers, but where he lacks are the physical metrics and run defense. Jones lacks ideal length. What I mean by that, to clarify, I'm talking about arm length. Not talking about height as much. Usually all these things go together, but with Jones, shorter arms, small hands, but height is fine, especially for the slot. But Jones lacks ideal length, making it hard to envision him as a top option to play on the boundary, and he seems to lack good tackling form. I would like to see Jones play inside in a rotational role against pass-heavy offenses, because that's where he should thrive. Getting him involved against run-heavy teams could get a team into trouble, but he's a good piece in the rotation. And that has the ability to change, right? Like we said, if he can get better at tackling, and that is a problem, right? It's not the easiest thing to figure out, and not a good thing to try to project getting fixed at the NFL level. But if he can, I think he's a complete player, and I think he could be a good starter. And the ceiling is being worth a pick, especially given that the NFL values these slot cornerbacks more. And really, the ceiling is not only being worth a pick, but I would say it's being a very good pick, because if he does work out over the next couple of years, well, you got a really good player in the third round. That's a great deal for the team. And I think the value of what he could be at his best could be a second rounder, right? That's probably what I would attribute to that if he becomes a complete player and a good starter for the Jaguars, even if he's not starting a couple of those years. So we'll have to see what happens. But overall, my final grade for this, I think I'm going to go probably with the C+. I'll reserve the right to maybe update that a little bit, but I would go with C+, because you look at rankings, he fell right around 96. I think there were other players that did make more sense, though. And I know Jacksonville obviously targeted a player that is not going to start immediately, but there were still a lot of players on the board, and it's not necessarily as bad as the Mason Smith pick in terms of this discussion, but there were a lot of players on the board I think were more valuable at that point. Javon Baker was one of them. You could say, well, Javon Baker's not starting, right? We got 3 receivers, and they're all locked down for the next 2 years at least as far as guarantees. And obviously Christian Kirk you can move on from, but do you want to do that? No, I don't want to do that. So, getting a Javon Baker probably is not the best one-year investment, but I do think he's going to be a good starter, right? And so there's other players you could throw out. You could talk about TJ Tampa as an air corner. You need an outside guy. I think Tampa, the speed is a little bit of a concern, but I think he could project pretty well to the scheme and at least be as good of a starter as Jarrian Jones, and probably a better one in a more valuable spot. That's nitpicking, of course. That's why I don't give this a D or an F or something like that. But I think as far as the value of the pick, they got someone who's worth it. It's a crowd position, but it's one that they'll need investments at, and they're preparing for the future. I commend that. And it could work out very well. And so it's not my favorite, but considering some of these other picks, it is towards the top of the list, at least for the Jaguars. So I'll give it a C+. That's where I'd sit on this. And we'll see what happens with Jones. I'm excited to go see him play. And I think it could work out really well if we have a little bit of patience over this rookie deal for him with the Jacksonville Jaguars. So that's all I've got on Jarrian Jones. As far as what's coming up here on the channel, I plan right now to at least have one more film breakdown that will be with Javon Foster, the pick at 114. He was one of my guys throughout most of this process. Don't know if I considered him a my guy at the very end, but he's a good player. I think he's going to be a very good rotational tackle. I've not revisited him yet. I will do that before recording, but someone I liked a lot and I think is going to fill an important position for the Jaguars, even if it's not necessarily being a starter. And then we've also got the schedule releasing. That's releasing a day for me, actually probably in about 6 hours. So we'll talk about that. I'll probably give a prediction for record, which games I think they'll win and lose. And then we'll get into summer scouting. That's going to come up very soon. We're going to hit hopefully every position. And I hope to have really good notes for you guys. And some of y'all, it's not your thing. Totally get that, right? 2025 NFL drafts in April of next year. We just got our guys a couple weeks ago, but it's a year-round process, and I know some of you guys also love that. It's something I enjoy. We got a lot of time during the offseason, so we're going to hit on that, and it'll probably start with the wide receiver position, so really excited to get into it. But that's all I've got for you guys today. I appreciate y'all joining. Let me know your thoughts on Jarrian Jones, what you would grade the pick, and what you think the Jacksonville Jaguars are going to do this year as far as record, because that's happening today. We're going to get the schedule. So thanks for joining. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.